everybody for being here. Everybody hear me okay?
Yeah, great.
Because I don't want to use the mic. If I don't have to, I will. But I like moving around. My students have figured out that if I'm moving, I'm a harder target. And so I've sort of adopted the movement. Also, it looks good on my phone because I get my steps, right, when I'm teaching. So if I teach for 3 hours and I move the entire time, I can relax when I get home. So methods to the madness of being a walking teacher. It really is wonderful to be here, to be invited to speak with you today. I have been doing research on the history of slavery, abolitionism, the Underground Railroad in Greater Lowell for about 25 years, off and on. I've written quite a bit. I've also worked with the city of Lowell to do what, for lack of anything more creative, we've developed a Black History Trail, which sort of tells over from the 1700s to the present a history of the Black community and of this history in the city. I also did something similar with Native American groups in the area on the Native American history of our region. I'm a firm believer in history having to be public. I shouldn't say I hate, that's too strong a word. I dislike historians who only write for the book that hardly anybody reads. We have to do that for our careers. If you know about a university, we're supposed to publish or perish, right? And if we're not writing books, we don't get our promotions, and if we don't get our promotions, you can be fired, right? And so we write a lot of things, but we never really, many of us think about, okay, so what? What does it mean? What do we make of it? What's the lesson for now? And that's really what I think about a lot in what I do. I can write an academic book with the best of them. I noticed a couple over there on the table. Whoever did that, I probably get 7 cents in royalties for each of those books. All right, so to the matter at hand. The way typically, and I was taught this when I was in college, I was taught it when I was in grad school, the way typically we've thought about the history of enslavement and the plantation economy and cotton is to see that as some distant thing way down there. And way down there means the South. And we were all the good people and we were all righteous and whatever. Not true. So I'll dissuade you of that at the outset. I'll argue with anybody that wants to argue with me about that. And I know I will win. I have history on my side. So go ahead, fire away. I will leave time at the end for questions and discussion and comments. Also, if something's not clear when I'm saying it, just say, wait, what? Also, by the way, I know I'm in Westford, not Westfield. I did say Westfield over there because I lived in Holyoke while I was in graduate school, and Holyoke and Westfield are side by side. So please forgive me. I know it's Westford. I put Westford into my phone this morning to find my way here. But I thank you. Actually, I was gonna make a joke and say, I said Westfield on purpose just to see if anybody was listening, but that's not true. So I don't want to start off with a lie. That's like a bad way to start a talk. So I also worked on a documentary called A Contradictory Place, which is about a 40-minute documentary on the history of Lowell. What I'm going to do now in 20 minutes is in a documentary, and basically the more the research I did, the more I realized how the history of Lowell that's taught is limited in the way that it's presented. And if you've ever been fortunate enough to go through the Boot Mill Museum at Lowell, or take a canal boat ride, or do any of those really wonderful things that the National Park has for people, a lot of times, depending on who the ranger is, the links between Lowell and cotton somehow don't come up. It's as if by magic there's some raw material in the mills of Lowell, and we all live happily ever after. That's not true. The other thing is that the northern economy, the New England economy, is completely dependent on its relationship to enslavement. The wealth of Bostonians, the really, really wealthy people that fund Harvard, the Museum of Fine Arts, and all those things that are glorious in Boston, all that wealth, all those beautiful estates on Beacon Street, all those incredible buildings and things, that all, and the money initially for that comes from the slave trade. The wealthiest Bostonians, the wealthiest people in Providence, in Newport, in Newburyport, everybody on the sort of northern seacoast has made their money on what, from looking around the room, many of us learned in school as the so-called triangular trade. And it was taught to us as just this really nice thing. This stuff went there and that stuff went here. And oh yeah, by the way, some people came this way. And then that's that, and it's gone. And we don't really fully grasp the situation. And so in the founding of the new country, the signing of the Constitution, it outlaws the international slave trade coming in 1806. And so the wealthy Bostonians who have made their money on the trade now have to figure out how they're going to keep making their money, right? Because once you have a lot of money, you want to make a lot more money. That's kind of how these people, I'm oversimplifying, but that's how they operated. And so they decided that, okay, we now have severed our relationship with England. If we want to build an economy, if we want to grow as a new country, we need to start making stuff. We're sending all of our money to England whenever we buy anything. How are we going to develop our own economic system and our own economic security? What if Britain comes back and attacks us? And we don't have the ability to make anything to defend ourselves. We're just sending all our money away. It's a drain. And so they hit on the idea, first, of starting to build textile mills. Sort of start with some basic commodities. And so the idea is to harness water power. We don't have electricity yet. We don't have steam engines. We don't have coal. We don't have that sort of stuff. We need water power. And so Lowell is Lowell because the river's there. All the land where Lowell is today had been Native American land. And then it's basically farmland after that. And then these enterprising elites from Boston come north, start building textile mills on the river. And again, it's cotton. And it's enslavement. And so what you end up having in Lowell as the 19th century progresses is this interesting contradiction, again to use that word, this interesting sort of like how do these things fit together of the entirety of the economic system of Lowell depends on cotton. And yet increasingly after 1830, there's an anti-slavery movement growing in the city of Lowell. And it's really strange to think about that even some of the mill overseers, some of the bosses of the mills, are some of the people who start anti-slavery societies. And so on the one hand, they're supervising and operating a textile mill that's consuming tons and tons of cotton on an annual basis, and they leave work in the afternoon or late afternoon or early evening, and then they go to an abolitionist meeting. They go downtown to Lowell and hear Frederick Douglass, or William Lloyd Garrison, the famed abolitionist who was born in Newburyport, or an enslaved person who's escaped and is coming north through Lowell to make it into Canada on the Underground Railroad. And so this like baffled me. Like how do these folks reconcile it? I haven't quite figured that out. There's a psychology there that I don't understand, that I don't completely understand. I have good friends in the psychology department, and I talk to them about, okay, get me inside the brain of somebody that lives this duplicitous life. In the morning, they're like shoveling cotton and ordering workers around, and at night, they're trying to figure out how to stop the spread of slavery. It doesn't completely fit. But some of the mill overseers who were abolitionists were also Quakers. And so I think some of the anti-slavery in them was connected to their faith, to being Quakers, right? But again, like, why are you the overseer of a mill then, dude? Like, what? Why? Like, can you find something better to do with your time? And the other thing that's interesting, quick detour, and then I'm going to go back to this. while these same mill overseers were supervising by day and being abolitionists by night, if women textile mill workers in Lowell tried to organize for a shorter workday or more money, they would fire them. So these were contradictory people through and through. They hated their workers and would do anything they could do to get more work out of them and pay them as little as possible. They were using enslaved labor every day in the cotton mills, and then at night they were talking about. Now maybe they thought they were going to be saved. Don't strike me. Maybe they thought they would be, like, that was their out. They could do all these other things that were horrible, crimes against humanity, if you will, and yet, well, at least we're against this thing. I don't know. Nobody that I've found has left behind some, like rummaging around in their own brain about, like, did at some point they have an awakening. But several of the leading mill overseers in Lowell were leaders of the abolitionist movement in the city. So increasingly, historians have started making these kinds of connections, as we can hear. Sven Becker is a professor at Harvard, probably one of the best recent books. And so historians have coined this expression, the lords of the lash and the lords of the loom. And so the people who own large plantations in the South have great friendships with people in the North who own textile mills. Their sons go to school together at Harvard and at Yale and at Princeton. That's why like Princeton and Yale and Harvard as well have had over the years to take names off of dormitories that were the names of like leaders of the Confederacy, right? But those names got on the buildings because basically these families intermingled, right? And so again, this is important to realize. This is a brand new book just out within the last few months. And in this book, the historian Seth Rockman, who teaches at Brown, has documented not the connection of cotton, but the connection of almost everything else being manufactured in Massachusetts. Boots, shoes, clothing, hats, shovels, picks, axes. All these factories in Massachusetts and throughout New England had as their major customer the plantation. And so what historians are increasingly trying to get people to think about when they're teaching this history is that you can't separate out the North and the South, and you can't say that's where the bad guys were, but we were okay. No, we were all in on it. This was a rotten kind of a coalition. And to your question, which is a great one, did people know what they were doing? Absolutely. I mean, by the 1820s, 1830s, people have been fleeing slavery. People have been making their way north and telling their stories. People are speaking throughout New England as they're moving through New England to get to Canada. They're telling people what's happening. Frederick Douglass, once he has escaped in the late 1820s, he lives in Newbury, he lives in New Bedford for a while, he lives in Lynn for a while. He's touring New England, telling people what his life was like, being separated from his mom at age 10, never seeing her again, things like that. So stories are being told. Nobody can say no. So this is a record of one of the mills in Lowell in the 1840s. And you can see here, one of the commodities that sold is something called Negro cloth. So one of the products of Lowell in massive quantity was a really coarse material that was used for pants and jackets and shirts that basically plantation owners bought to clothe enslaved people. And so I asked my students to think about that, because essentially what you're doing is taking the cotton from enslaved people, moving it into a factory, turning it into a cloth that's put into a pant or a shirt, and is shipped back down again. And so you're in effect wearing your embodied labor, right? And again, this is known. It's called Negro cloth. They know what they're doing. Again, just to be really, really clear. Here's another important point. Lots of people will make the argument Well, do we really need the Civil War? Wasn't slavery going away anyway? Yeah, no. You can see the numbers. It's not going away, it's growing, it's expanding. Another huge customer for cotton is England. The major the major export of America is enslaved labor cotton. That's pumping the treasury of the United States of America. And the shipping industry. Right? Again, these things are so connected. You can see, right? I mean, you look at Lowell, 22 mills in 1832, 52 mills in 1858. Then look at the amount of cotton consumed. It increases exponentially. And it's not a magical way to harvest the cotton. It's done by, to plant it and pick it, it's done by human labor. We've invented machinery like the cotton gin to take the seeds out of it. But the actual physical labor in the field hasn't changed. And so again, you can see the number. Pounds of cotton. This is in a week. 805,000 pounds of cotton consumed a week. That's, by my math, like a little over 4 tons. A week. Not in a year, in a week. Yes?
Do those numbers drop after 1865?
The amount of cotton?
Yeah, for the slave population.
Well, after 1865, slavery ends.
Right.
So that would be, if you looked at the 1870 census, it would be 0. Then we're on to a whole other conversation about what that means, right? Again, as people were talking about this morning. And so, switch up a little bit, I'm being mindful of time. Theodore Edson, one of the most influential ministers in the city of Lowell during this period of time. Edson, ironically enough, is brought to Lowell to be the minister of St. Anne's Episcopal Church by Kirk Boot, who is the owner of one of the largest textile mills in Lowell. Edson, as soon as he gets to Lowell, starts opening his eyes and says, oh, we're going to have some anti-slavery stuff going on here. In St. Anne's Church, if you've ever been to Lowell, it's a beautiful stone, incredible edifice right in downtown Lowell on Merrimack Street. He becomes one of the outspoken leaders of abolitionism. It's a quote. And we hereby mutually pledge ourselves that we'll strive by every means which we can conscientiously employ to overthrow the system of American slavery. That's a heck of a position for him to be publicly taking on Sunday. But he does. Slavery's legal. Again, let's keep this in mind. The trade is not legal, but the institution of slavery is legal. It's written into the American Constitution. It's in there. It's why we need the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. It's in there, right? Each enslaved person, again, for just to remind us, is counted for political representation in the South in Congress. There's a clause in the Constitution that says each enslaved person equals 3/5 of a person, right? When you get people in the House of Representatives, it's based on the population of your state, right? And so the South is overrepresented, if you will, because there's 4 million enslaved people. They're each worth 3/5 of a person. Obviously, they're worth a whole person, but just stick with the metaphor here. And that means they get that many more people in the House of Representatives, which is why, over the course of the time that we're talking about, increasingly more and more and more bills support the institution of slavery and keeping it legal. The South dominates political representation in the country. Again, that's inescapable. The history's clear if we want to actually look at it and drag from it the historical reality. This is Edson's church. In this church, this is the church rectory. The building is still there today. In the rectory, Edson harbored fugitives. I have been in the basement of that church where there's a hideout. If anybody's coming looking for people on the Underground Railroad, I've crawled around in there. It's pretty incredible. Like, it's like, again, if you're a geek for history like I am, it's like Whoa, I can't imagine. The church is pretty far away from the river. They built a tunnel from the hideaway in the basement of the church out to a spot on the river where people could, if they were being chased, could get into the hideaway and end up going through the tunnel and get out to the river, so that they wouldn't be caught. And then there were several other places in Lowell where people could go in different parts of the city. I'm going to show you in a minute something more specific. So this is Edson again, West Indian Emancipation Day. So England ends the institution of slavery in the Caribbean long before the U.S., and they don't have to have a civil war to do it. And Edson is an admirer of what England did, and so on August 1, 1838, he kept these copious diaries. I'm going to draw from them again in a second. And he wrote about the British government, not only set an example of vast importance and of great weight, but has demonstrated the practicability of emancipation and the superior feasibility as well as desirableness of immediate over gradual emancipation. And so in black communities in New England, oftentimes they did not celebrate the 4th of July. They would celebrate West Indian Emancipation Day and say that's a greater approximation. Then in 1852, Frederick Douglass writes his famous "What to the Slave is the 4th of July" speech, which if you've never read it, you need to. And when it comes to the 4th of July, read it. I actually did a public reading with 20 people the other day in Lowell, including like 7 and 8-year-olds. It was really something. Like the whole community of people reading it aloud. It was quite brilliant. You might want to try that as a community at some point. You can get a grant for it from Mass Humanities. They will buy snacks for you. But it's really worth reading. But Douglass says, what's this Declaration of Independence? What are we doing? What's that mean to us? Right? It's the same way here. So Edson and other people in Lowell, if they were connected in some way to the anti-slavery cause, they wouldn't necessarily go out and campaign against the 4th of July, but that would not be when they partied. They would party on this day. They would have a celebration on this day, someplace around in Greater Lowell. This is, again, Edson's diary. And so to show you how the Underground Railroad worked, just because sometimes it's not all that clear, my students will often ask me, was there a real train? In some cases there was. Douglass escaped from Maryland, where he was enslaved, by hiding on a train. And the train took him up through Washington, D.C., and then he made his way further north to New York, and then ended up living, as I said before, in New Bedford for a while, then Lynn, and then Rochester, New York. So sometimes there's an actual conveyance like a train. More often than not, it's a mythical underground railroad in the sense that there's not tracks, but people know how to move from house to house. This is an example of someone who ends up in the rectory that I showed you a minute ago in Lowell. March 19, 1839, and Edson's written this in his journal. Through New York he came to Boston, where he was very sick of pleurisy from exposure and traveling, lying out in the woods day and night. Mr. Garrison, this is William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist, befriended him. One day in Boston, he met unexpectedly a Kentucky slaveholder whom he knew and who recognized him. He felt that he must leave Boston. Mr. Garrison sent him to Salem to Mr. Dodge. His story gaining wind, he was afraid to stay there, came on to Andover, directed to Smith's at Fry Village. Smith directed him to come to me. Half a dozen stops to get from New York to Boston to Lowell. And then in Edson's diary, further on, he talks about him then leaving after recovering and ending up going to Canada, right? This is a painting done after the Civil War, trying in some way to depict sort of what people from oral histories and other things people did, what traveling on the Underground Railroad would be like. It's pretty powerful. I have my students sometimes, I'll put it up and I'll have them write for 20 minutes. What do you see? And then we'll talk about what they see, and then we'll talk about sort of this history. So this is a map of the Underground Railroad in and around the area where we are. And so the reference in Edson's diary of Fry Village, there's Fry Village. You can see it up there where there's like a little, that was me trying to be clever and note something. I didn't quite, my technology skills aren't that good. But you can see where those red lines are. That's kind of moving people from place to place. This was done, again, much after the Civil War, but the map maker, this guy, Siebert, basically interviewed, went south and then went north and interviewed people about how they traveled and where they stopped. And he made several maps. This is one of the many. This one obviously is relevant for us because you can see the Merrimack River there, Drake, Lawrence. And so it stands to reason that there were underground railroad stops here. Yes?
Fry Village, what is that?
Fry Village is in Andover.
Andover, okay.
But I would guess there are houses here where people were hid out. A little bit more, and then I'm going to, even if I don't finish, I'm going to stop so we have time to chat. This was a building on Dutton Street in Lowell. The street doesn't matter so much, but this was built in the 1830s by the Mechanics Association, which was a grouping of highly skilled metalworkers, machinists in Lowell who built textile machinery. And they built the building as a library, as a meeting place, and as like an apprenticeship school to teach people how to do metalworking machining. On the ground floor were businesses. And on the ground floor of this building were businesses that were owned by fugitives who had escaped and stayed in Lowell. Barbershop, grocery store, newspaper store, clothing store, all across the bottom of that building. And everybody in the Mechanics Association knew exactly who these people were. Theoretically, you were supposed to turn them in because they broke the law. They were property, right? Again, let's stick to what's the reality here. They were thought of as property that had basically run away. It's like my bicycle or my machine, right? Or my hoe or whatever, right? That's how the South would look at it, and theoretically, that's how you were supposed to look at it in the North. There were laws on the books that said you had to turn people in. And so again, being mindful of sort of the weird conditions we're in these days, they didn't turn them in. They didn't rat them out. And we know because here's Nathaniel Booth, one Mechanics Building, Dutton Street. Nathaniel Booth was a fugitive, one of many that lived in Lowell. We can see on the side his story. He fled Virginia when he was 17. Came to Lowell and stayed until something happened that he left, which we'll talk about in a second. But the beauty of doing research is you can find stuff if you want to take enough time and look. Right? This is a really old city directory. And as people were doing research, some of this done by students, some of this by other people, basically people find, okay, Nathaniel Booth. Then I say to myself, I wonder if he owns a business. I wonder if it's in the city directory. Get an old city directory and like, damn, there he is. Nathaniel Booth. Dutton Street. Crazy, right? Another person. Anybody know who the governor of Virginia is? Anybody know the last name of the governor of Virginia? Good civics question. His last name is Moore.
Westford?
Distant relative of an enslaved person. Right here, Edward Moore. I think the first name of the governor of Virginia is West.
Is it Maryland?
Say it again?
Maryland.
Oh, Maryland, sorry. Yeah, Westfield, Westford, Maryland, Virginia. I did that on purpose to see. Anyway, that's an interesting connection. The governor of Maryland related to a fugitive. Another barbershop, advertisement in a local newspaper. Everybody knew Horatio Foster was an enslaved person who had escaped and was living in Lowell, owned a business, advertised in the local paper. It's really incredible what you can find, right? If you take the time to look. This building, I'm going to go a little quicker. This building is now Enterprise Bank, if anybody's familiar with downtown Lowell. That initially was City Hall, old City Hall. On the top floor of this building, Frederick Douglass held court numerous times. And usually when he came to Lowell, he came with 2 or 3 other people who had escaped. And he was helping them move, and he was bringing them with him so they could tell their stories. And we have that documented of the different people that came. And on the upper floors where those windows are, every Christmas time, the abolitionist societies would form a holiday bazaar, they would call it. We would think of it now as like a tag sale. And they would bake and gather up stuff they wanted to get rid of in their attic, and they would basically sell it, and all the money that they raised would go to support the Underground Railroad. They would donate everything that was made to the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. Women in Lowell were the backbone of the abolitionist movement in the city of Lowell. This shouldn't surprise you, but it often surprises people. But young women who are working in the textile mills, the longer they work in the mills in Lowell, the easier it is for them to make connections between their work and how they're treated and the physical nature of their work. I'm not equating them as equal, to be really, really clear. Being an enslaved person is quite a bit different than being a young woman working in a textile mill in Lowell. But they could see this connection, and they become some of the greatest advocates in Lowell for anti-slavery. That over there is a petition to stop the slave trade in the District of Columbia, but their names are also on petitions to stop Texas from coming in to the Union, to the states as a state where slavery would be legal. So again, slavery is not dying out. We're fighting about whether new territories that want to be states can or can't have slavery. It's not like new states coming in, say post-1840, are coming in without slavery. No, we're not talking about ending it. That's not the conversation. Some people are. But the general conversation in Congress is should these, not we need to get rid of it, but which states can come in as slave, which states can come in as free. That's a political fight. And that's happening well into the 1850s, right? The institution's not ending. Here's the linchpin, and I'm almost done. This is good. So in 1850, because the numbers of people who are escaping is escalating, and because the abolitionist movement in Lowell and other places in the Northeast is growing, Southern politicians are deeply concerned about what's going to happen. And so they pushed through Congress something called the Fugitive Slave Law in 1850. The Fugitive Slave Law makes it a crime to, again, hide runaways. So it's going to reinforce laws that are on the books from the early 19th century that people are basically ignoring. Not everybody, but lots of people are ignoring. And now it makes it a federal offense. If you're detained, if you're picked up, if somebody says, that's a fugitive, you have no rights. Zip, zero. Think of immigrants being carted off now without any right to due process. That's that. No nothing. No lawyer, no charge, no right to plea on your own behalf. You could be a free black person who came to Lowell from one of the Caribbean islands and settled in Lowell, but because you're black, somebody can point at you and say, yep, that's the guy. And you're taken without any question asked. Somebody mentioned in the presentation this morning the Anthony Burns case. That becomes a famous one because he marched through the streets of Boston and put on a shift. and taken away. After that, vigilance committees in Boston start actually breaking people out of jail. People are incarcerated, they go like a mob of people into the jail and take people out and spirit them out of Boston, right? But again, what the fugitive slave law does is essentially make it a federal offense and force the issue on the general population in a way that lots of people aren't quite ready for. And so now there's this question of what do we know, what don't we know? That great quote from this morning. Yeah, now we know even more. The South is really upset because so many people are fleeing. So now you, white people in the North, have to help get all those enslaved people back south. And if you don't, you can go to jail. So signs like this go up everywhere with descriptions. And slave catchers, as they're referred to in the North, show up in communities throughout New England, just walking around looking for people. They don't have a warrant, they don't have charges, they don't have any proof that so-and-so should be there. They're just looking for people. This is close to here, Concord. It's not Westfield, it's close, right? An example of somebody else hiding people. This is a famous case. Shadrach Minkins is one of the people that gets broken out of jail. There's some great histories of that, including a really good kids one. That's again a house like very sort of similar to what I saw as I was driving here. So you could have a lot of houses here that had. And so last little bit. In 1850, when the fugitive slave law is passed, the black population in Lowell gets out of town. They go to Canada because they don't want to stick around and have somebody show up and cart them off. And so they leave, right? And a big meeting is called in Old City Hall in Lowell. And Chauncey Knapp is one of the conveners of the meeting. And Knapp basically asked people in the room to take a pledge. And he says, how many of you are willing to suffer death rather than let a fugitive slave be caught when it was in his or her power to prevent it? Huge cheer goes up. Everybody says, we will. Telegrams are sent to the community of black Lowellians who are now in Canada. And not everybody, but almost everybody comes back. Probably around 125, 130 people. And again, newspaper, 1850, man stealers in Lowell. And basically now, even newspapers that had not been so openly anti-slavery are basically calling the question. What's our responsibility here as human beings? And they're increasingly making the charge that you need to disobey federal law. You can't do this. What are we doing? And so this is a mainstream newspaper in Lowell in 1850. We hope, however, he will return. This is Nathaniel Booth, who they sent a telegram to. Return to the city, for we think there are men enough in Lowell. This is obviously, this should be written differently. Men enough in Lowell who believe in the higher law to protect him against all efforts of the man-stealers. This is a big deal. This is a public declaration from a significant population in the city to say, we don't care what the federal law says. That's a bunch of crap. We're not doing that. Last slide. Lowell's Daily Citizen, January 12, 1859. Bound for a Land of Freedom described how the day before 3 fugitives, husband, wife, and child, left Lowell and headed toward Canada. This is the article from the paper. The fugitives reached the city in an exhausted condition and were kindly cared for by some of our citizens, and after a couple of days' rest started on the last leg of their journey. 1,000 cheers for the Underground Railroad. It has paid a glorious dividend. Mainstream newspaper. how public opinion had shifted and how the conversation had changed. The fugitive slave law overplayed the hand of the federal government. It forced us to say, okay, what are we going to do now? We can't pretend we don't know. What are we going to do? The black history that we research and develop has turned into a walking tour around the downtown. There are several signs like that one that have the history of what we have learned, and the more we learn, the more signs go up. But it's an important way for people. The idea with this is for people to bump into history when they least suspect it, because most people, when you ask them if they like history, they say no. And I understand that. And so the idea is bump into it where you least expect it, and then maybe you'll take a bite of that. Maybe you'll read the sign, maybe not, but maybe you walk by it enough times that then you'll say, I wonder what that is. And you'll stop and read it. And so that's one about the cloth that's being produced, turn into clothing. And so, again, I think that all of this is researchable. That's another sign, but that's basically Lowell High School. But I will stop there. Thank you for listening.